Hi, welcome to Premium Builds, I'm John. The Asus B660 motherboard range is really confusing with a huge range of options. So we've selected a couple of the mid-range choices and we're going to take a closer look at them in this video. We'll run them through our testing for a number of CPUs to see how they perform, and we'll be able to make recommendations to you as to what kind of PC they'll work well in at the end of this video. So sit tight and let's take a look at the options. Under test, we've got the Asus Prime B660M-A Wi-Fi D4 and the Asus TUF B660M-E. We've run them both through our testing involving an i3, i5 and an i7 CPU, and we've spent long enough with them to assess their performance, setup and flexibility in a range of systems and workloads. It's useful to compare and contrast these two motherboards because it helps us understand the similarities and differences, where one might be a better choice than another for you, and hopefully it will help you decide which motherboard is right for you. We'll run through their specifications, their feature set, and what applications we think they might be best suited to. First up, let's take a look around the Asus B660M-A Wi-Fi and have a look at its specification. Around here we can see it's got a relatively weak 8-phase VRM total with 6 phases to the CPU core, and this is really the bare minimum of VRM we'd consider suitable for an i5 CPU. You can also see it's got the 8-pin CPU power connector in the top corner, so that's all you need to power this board adequately. The non-Wi-Fi version misses out on this top section of heatsinking, and the Wi-Fi version has heatsinking on both sections of the VRM, which is a slightly strange specification change. The RAM slots, there are 4 DDR4 RAM slots on this variant, which quotes up to 128GB of DDR4 RAM, up to 5333 MHz is quoted, although sensible RAM is much slower than that, around 3600, 3200 MHz. There are 2 M.2 slots, both of them are PCIe 4.0. This one connects direct to the CPU, and this one connects via the chipset. It's worth noting that they are PCIe only, and neither of them will take a SATA M.2 drive, so you need to get PCIe drives to work in those slots. Note that the board also has a USB 3.2 Gen 2 header next to the 24-pin port, and if you do need high-speed ports on the front of your case, you should ensure that the case has that connectivity built in. You've got 3 PCIe slots, all 3 are full length physically, however the top one is PCIe 4.0 x 16, the middle one is PCIe 3.0 x 1, and the bottom one is PCIe 3.0 x 4. The audio is courtesy of the basic ALC897 codec, which is a budget chip, but it's exactly what we'd expect to see on a board of this quality and price. There are 4 SATA connectors in the bottom corner here, and in terms of additional headers, we've got 4 fan headers total, one of them located at the rear here, one of them tucked behind the 24 pin just here. There is then a CPU fan header and a CPU optional fan header at the top here, which can also be set to run a chassis fan without an issue. They're all auto-detect PWM or 3-pin 12-volt fans. There's no RGB itself on the board, but there are in fact a good number of RGB headers. There's 3 5-volt headers and 1 12-volt header. Of note is the fact that there are no boot diagnostic LEDs on this motherboard. It uses the power LED connected to the case to flash out error codes if there are any problems booting. So make sure you have these pins correctly connected down here. Taking a closer look at the rear panel, you can see that we've got 3 visual outputs. There's 2 HDMI and 1 DisplayPort, which is useful if you're connecting multiple monitors in an office environment, for example. In terms of USB, you've just got the 6 USB-A ports, and only 2 of them are the faster 10GB per second specification. The other 4 are USB 2.0, so do watch out for that. And if you do have a good range of high-speed peripherals, card readers or other fast drives that you want to connect to this motherboard, make sure you're using the correct ports and make sure you're not going to run out of high-speed ports. For networking, the networking Ethernet chip is a 1GB per second Intel LAN controller, which is relatively slow but nothing outrageous. This is the Wi-Fi model with Wi-Fi 6, however there's a non-Wi-Fi version available as well. And there's just 3 standard audio jacks on the rear for audio output. Overall it's a relatively disappointing rear I/O, mainly down to the fact that there's lack of faster USB ports. It's also worth noting that in the box you get a Wi-Fi antenna with a base on it as well, which connects to the Wi-Fi ports at the rear. And this is the I/O shield, which is a relatively tinny affair. It's pretty basic, just with stamped indicators on the rear. It's not a particularly nice rear I/O shield, although it's acceptable at the price. The main disappointment with the Asus Prime is really the lack of fast USB ports on the rear. There's just 2 of those fast 10GB per second ports, and the rest are USB-A 2.0 specification. If you do have a range of data-hungry peripherals like VR headsets, or you want to connect fast drives to them, that does become a limitation quite quickly. There's also no USB-C port on the rear, and we'd really advise if you are going to buy this motherboard, you make sure you get a case that's got a USB 3.2 header on it, so that you can connect faster ports to the front of your case. There aren't really any other painful omissions or oversights in the specification of the Prime motherboard. It's got two M.2 slots. That main PCIe slot is PCIe 4, not PCIe 5, but that's an acceptable compromise at this price point. There aren't even cards that are using PCIe 5 specification yet. One other thing that we think is just a cost-cutting step taken too far on this motherboard is the lack of any boot diagnostic LEDs. It actually flashes error codes through your case's power button, so it's really important when you first set it up that you do plug in those power button LED indicators to the correct spot on the motherboard. If you make a mistake there and the PC doesn't boot, you may get no indication whatsoever of what the fault is, and that can be a problem on your first setup. For the cost of them, we'd really like to see just a set of 4 boot LEDs would really help first-time builders and the less experienced PC builders out in diagnosing any issues they might have on first boot. The other slight cost-cutting measure on the Asus Prime is that it does have just 2 chassis fans in addition to the CPU fan and the CPU optional fan headers. So do make sure that you can power all the fans you're going to fit to your case. You may have to budget for a fan splitter or a fan hub if you're fitting more than 3 case fans to this motherboard in addition to the CPU cooler fan, so bear that in mind. Now let's take a closer look at the Asus TUF Gaming B660M-E D4. First up, we can see it's got a slightly stronger VRM than the Prime. This is 10 phases total with 8 to the CPU core. It uses a Digi Plus VRM. Note also that the VRM for this model lacks the heat sinking on the top section, although it does actually have the mounting holes for it. The CPU power socket is again a single 8-pin. There is also a Plus variant of this motherboard which has a stronger VRM overall. This is perfectly adequate for running the i3 and i5 CPUs without an issue. However, we'd say if you are going to run an i7 CPU, you probably want to look for a slightly stronger VRM. There are 4 RAM slots again, and it quotes 5300 MHz maximum RAM speed, although that's on a single stick and not really practicable. Much more sensible RAM specifications around 3200 to 3600 MHz. There are 2 M.2 storage slots again, located here which runs direct to the CPU with PCIe 4.0, and here which runs via the chipset again at PCIe 4.0. Neither of these slots accept SATA M.2 drives, so you will need to make sure that any drives you fit are PCIe specification. Whilst the layout is slightly different, the specification of the PCIe slots is exactly the same as the Asus Prime. The top slot here for the GPU is PCIe 4.0x16. The middle slot is single length physically and PCIe 3.0x1. The lower slot is PCIe 3.0x4. The audio on this motherboard is again provided by the budget ALC 897 audio codec, which is perfectly serviceable at the price point, but it is a fairly basic audio solution. In terms of SATA, again we see that we have 4 SATA ports, and they're slightly awkwardly placed on this motherboard. 2 are 90 degrees down on this bottom edge, and 2 of them are placed here next to the 24 pin. It's just a slightly unusual placement. Note that it does have the USB 3.2 Gen 2 header to connect to your case, the same as the Asus Prime. In terms of fans and cooling, there is a chassis fan connector just located here behind the heatsink. There's another one located on the bottom edge of the board here, and then you've got the CPU fan header and the chassis fan header or CPU optional fan header located just by the CPU. It's acceptable, but it's not an impressive number of fan headers. We'd like to see one more ideally on a board like this. For RGB control, we can see that there are 3 RGB 5V headers and 1 12V header here as well. This section of the motherboard lights up with RGB highlights, which is quite a pleasing effect. This board does have boot diagnostic displays located in the top corner here, showing you whether there's a problem with CPU, DRAM, the graphics card, or just an overall problem with boot and post. Moving to look at the rear I/O of the board, we can see that again we have just 6 USB-A ports, but on this model, 2 of them are USB 2.0, 2 of them are USB 3.2, which allows 5 gigabit per second, and 2 of them are USB 3.2 Gen 2, which allow 10 gigabit per second transfer. That is just slightly more flexibility in rear port speed, and allows you to collect a wider range of higher speed devices without any issues. For networking, we have a Realtek 2.5 gigabit per second LAN controller, which is perfectly acceptable for general use and home use. This model actually lacks Wi-Fi, but there isn't an M.2 E-key slot just here so that you can add a small Wi-Fi card, or of course you can add a PCIe one in one of the lower slots here. Note that it lacks USB-C, and you'll want to make sure that your case has that feature to connect to the internal header if it's something that you want. In terms of other items that come with the board, again it has a separate I/O shield. This one is slightly nicer than the Prime's. It is at least padded and has a sticker for the labels on it. It also has some pre-made cutouts so that if you do add an add-in Wi-Fi card, the aerials present themselves nicely at the rear I/O. The Asus TUF does have a more livable I/O configuration on that rear panel, with 2 fast, 2 medium speed, 5 gigabit per second ports, and then 2 USB 2 ports, which are fine for a keyboard and mouse, for example. It just gives you access to a wider range of higher speed ports, and that means you've got more flexibility in the peripherals you connect and where you connect them to. It's also got a set of 4 boot code diagnostic LEDs, which are a nice little feature and can just point you in the right direction if you are having any problems getting the PC to post for the first time. Otherwise, the specification is really quite similar. It's still got 2 M.2 ports, the PCIe configuration is the same, and it's got a relatively strong VRM. It's perfectly acceptable for using an i5 CPU, but we'll see a little bit more about that in the performance section coming up. The major omission we can see on the TUF motherboard is really just the lack of fan headers. It only has 2 chassis fan headers. There is another CPU optional fan header that you can use for a chassis fan, but ideally we'd like to see a minimum of 3 chassis fan headers on the motherboard to allow you flexibility in how you set up your cooling. Just make sure if you are using this motherboard that you have a fan splitter or even a fan hub. You can drive all of the fans you choose to put into your case off of, and make sure you're not going to be left with fans that you can't power without buying additional equipment. Overall, both of these motherboards do have a relatively well balanced feature set at the price. The Prime does just feel a little bit cut down. It's definitely at the budget end of the B660 motherboard range, but it's got everything you really need to get a PC up and running. It does just feel a little bit cheapskate in a couple of areas, namely the lack of fan headers, that rear I/O panel, and the lack of a dedicated LED boot diagnostic display. The TUF just makes a few little concessions towards ease of use and styling that lift it above into a firmly mid-range category for the B660 motherboard lineup. Overall, we'd say that the Prime's feature set is acceptable but nothing more, whereas the TUF's is quite reasonable really, and it makes a decent mid-range motherboard option. Let's take a look then at the BIOS and how easy it is to get around in there, make some settings changes and set the PC up how you want it. The Asus BIOS is easy enough to get on with, and the BIOSes on these 2 boards are simple reskinnings of one another. They've got the same features and functionality. There's easy and advanced modes. You shouldn't need to do much in here beyond enabling XMP and perhaps tweaking fan profiles to your liking, since there's no official overclocking support for CPUs. We were able to adjust both DRAM and system agent voltage with a non-K CPU and the launch BIOS version. Some people report issues with higher speed RAM that can't be fixed by bumping up the voltage, either because they found it locked to a relatively low level or just that it hasn't helped stabilize the RAM. It's a perfectly good functional BIOS. We had no problem setting up either of these boards, building them into systems and installing Windows 10 or Windows 11 at default settings. They posed no problems whatsoever. The main issue to be aware of with the BIOS on these motherboards is the way Asus effectively defaults to a higher power limit setting via the splash screen it shows on first boot and you hitting F1 to go into BIOS. At that screen you are in fact making a choice. You are instructing the motherboard to lift power limits to Asus performance enhancement levels, which means higher power use by the CPU, and that can have a severe impact on thermals. It does however mean that your CPU will likely perform optimally even without you delving into any settings at all yourself. This is fine for i5 CPUs, and if you're using an aftermarket cooler that can cope with around 100 watts or so of heat output. However, if you're using the stock cooler or you're running an i7 CPU, you will need to go back into BIOS and ensure that you're using the recommended power limits on either of these motherboards. This is to protect the VRM and CPU from overheating, as otherwise it will try and run the processors on full power for as long as possible, and this can cause performance and stability issues. Let's take a look at performance. As part of our testing process, we ran these boards with an i3, an i5 and an i7 K-series CPU to see how they handled power limits and to see what their performance was like. Both boards tested well throughout our range of tests, supplying adequate power to all CPUs to allow for optimal performance. However, a word of caution again about Asus performance enhancement. Neither of these boards have a high-end VRM configuration, and yet both supplied 200 watts to the i7-12700K in our tests. This allowed for optimal performance in short and mid-length workloads, but we don't believe that these VRMs are sensible for that kind of power output over sustained periods. You'll be fine with an i5, and likely also an i5-12600K or an i7 non-K CPU, which will run at a 75 watt default long-term power level. But you should check those power limits and ensure they're set sensibly in BIOS to ensure system stability and that the VRMs don't overheat. Overall, we think either of these boards is a really strong pairing with an i3 or an i5 CPU. You'll experience no problems, they're capable of running them to full potential and delivering the power those CPUs need. However, we would voice a note of caution if you're intending to run an i7 CPU on these motherboards. Realistically, we think that the stronger VRM of a motherboard like the MSI Pro B660M-A is a much better fit for that. We've tested that, we know that it can withstand the sort of 200 watt continuous power demands of those CPUs at full load. Taking a quick look at RAM stability considerations, there's been a lot of interest about the optimal RAM for Alder Lake and what RAM can be stabilised effectively on these motherboards. RAM stability is really down more to the RAM kit and also the CPU itself than it is to the motherboard specifically. Both of these motherboards quote very high maximum RAM speeds, but they're not really sensible in terms of the value and the performance you get at really high RAM speeds on this platform. Realistically, 3200 MHz and 3600 MHz should be stable on this platform. We've certainly tested 3600 MHz CL16. Our G-Skill kit runs at XMP in Gear 1 on both of these motherboards. On the i3, i5 and i7 CPUs we've tested with no issues at all. However, we do know some people have experienced problems that they haven't been able to resolve easily. Therefore, we'd say if stability is your key concern, 3200 MHz CL16 RAM is the sweet spot of fit it and forget. Not a problem at all, and it will give really good performance on these platforms. 3600 MHz CL16, if you can't stabilise it in Gear 1, you can run it at Gear 2, and whilst it is a slight performance deficit, it's still a strong RAM configuration and it'll still give you really good performance. So considering the value of these boards with everything we've learned about them, we'd say that they offer decent but not outstanding value. And it does obviously depend on local pricing and availability. We've seen a range of prices for these motherboards. The Asus Prime is certainly towards the lower end of B660 motherboards that we'd consider viable. It just scrimps on a few little areas that mean that it's a harder sell. There's not as much to attract you to buy that motherboard. That lack of those fast USB ports on the rear, the slightly scrimping spec in terms of things like fan headers and the lack of LED boot diagnostics do eat into its value proposition a little bit. However, it is one of the few boards that looks good with silver heat sinking at the entry-level price range. So if you're planning a white build but you're on a bit of a budget, it does fit that brief well. And as we said, it will run and pair with an i3 or an i5 CPU really well and give good performance. The Asus TUF is much more of a mid-range board, and I'd expect it to be slightly more expensive in most markets. If it's the same price as the Asus Prime, then it's the clear winner. It's a better looking board, it's got better features in terms of that rear I/O and slightly stronger VRM, and again we're very confident it will run an i5 CPU without any issues at all. It does get our recommendation for a gaming PC and an i5 CPU. If it's the right price for you, then you'll have no issues, and we think it's a really good buy. So I'd like to take a moment just to talk about the market that these boards exist in and the competition in the mid-range of the B660 motherboard lineup. It is a really complicated landscape out there with loads of boards to choose from and some very similar specifications. The Asus Prime and Asus TUF ranges really don't help this. We've identified no fewer than 8 variants of each motherboard, possibly up to 12 Asus Primes. The Asus site itself doesn't list them clearly, which doesn't help, so you can't differentiate, and it looks like they do differ in specification and naming between markets as well. You won't necessarily be looking at the same motherboards in America as you are in Europe, for example. There's ATX and non-ATX versions, there's DDR4 and DDR5 versions, Wi-Fi and non-Wi-Fi versions, and then you've got things like the Asus Prime M-A and the Asus Prime Plus, and again you've got the TUF Gaming M-E and the M-Plus as well. It really does come together to create a really confusing landscape for the consumer. We'd caution that you look really carefully, particularly when you're shopping online, that you compare specifications closely and ensure that you're getting what you think you are when you click the pay button. In particular, you need to watch out for DDR5 variants for this motherboard, which do exist and we have seen them for sale, and these are boards that you should only consider if you're looking at DDR4 RAM. There are even boards out there like the Asus Prime B660M-K, which only has one M.2 slot and 2 RAM slots. It's a real budget-cutting entry-level board, and it's not one we'd recommend unless it's literally all you can afford and you're running an i3 CPU on it. In short, the landscape for B660 motherboards is a real mess, and we can see why people are confused if you're just shopping around for a cost-effective motherboard to get your older late PC up and running. We are preparing a full roundup of the B660 motherboard range so that we can make our recommendations to you for any kind of processor and system you're trying to build. That will be coming as soon as we've got the relevant information together and we can present the video on it for you. So I really hope that'll help. Please do like and subscribe if that's something you want to see, because it will really help our channel out. It helps us get our information out there. So in conclusion then, we can recommend each of these boards in their own product sector. If it comes down to a straight choice between the two of them, then we'd absolutely recommend the Asus TUF as the better board. It does have better feature set, it offers you better value for money, and we think it's a really nice board to pair with an i5 CPU and a gaming build. The Asus Prime has its place as well. It is a cost-effective motherboard. It will run an i3 or an i5 CPU well, and if you need it for just general use, a bit of gaming, it's a perfectly acceptable board. Just make sure it has got the feature set you need to connect the peripherals you want to connect to it, the fans you want to connect to it, and you're going to be happy with the feature set it has to offer you. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, we just feel it could offer a little bit stronger value at the price point. If either of these boards doesn't perfectly meet your needs, then you can look around the ranges, both the Asus Prime and the Asus TUF range, and see whether there's, for example, an ATX motherboard, a motherboard with Wi-Fi, or those Plus motherboards that offer just slightly better feature set for a little bit more money. See how they look and whether they actually offer better value for your needs. Overall though, Asus have trodden a fine line here between offering the features you need and asking a price that is reasonable but not outstanding in the market. I really hope this video has been useful to you. Please do like and subscribe, particularly if you want to see our full B660 motherboard roundup, which is in the works. We'll be giving you recommendations right across the range of motherboards for any CPU you care to put on them, and making sure you get absolutely the best value for money as you build your next PC. Please do check out premiumbuilds.com. We've got some really exciting projects coming up that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you guys. So have a look around the site. It's got some good advice and guides on there for you as you build your next PC.